We are delighted to welcome you for a virtual tour of St. Andrew's, whose story began nearly 200 years ago. In 1819, Bartholomew O'Connor and Charles O'Hara traveled 40 miles to Dundas to ask a priest to come say Mass for them in the O'Hara's log cabin in Trafalgar Township. 4 years later, a log church was built at the corner of the 9th Line and Britannia, replaced by a brick-clad St. Peter's in 1858. By 1835, some 150 parishioners, including Oakvillians, were attending the Trafalgar Mission, but by 1836, a separate Oakville mission was formed. In the first of many examples of ecumenism which characterized the parish's history, Presbyterian town founder William Chisholm gave Lot D of Block 35 in April of 1837 for the building of their church. From 1838 to 1840, the parishioners raised funds through subscription to buy the supplies the volunteer Catholic craftsmen would need. The other 5 lots of Block 35 were bought and transferred in 1855 by George Chisholm, his father having died 13 years previous. 5 years earlier, when the Methodists circulated a subscription list to fund the building of St. John's on Dunn Street, the parishioners of St. Andrew's chipped in their financial support. A virtual walk around the block helps to begin the story of St. Andrew's and orients a visitor to the church and its adjacent buildings. The building that now graces Block A at the corner of William and Reynolds was essential for the mission's growth into an established parish. After serving as a convent for 3 decades, it was renovated to become a center for parish activities in the early 1990s, but for a century before that, from 1858 until 1957, this home was the Rectory. Until it was built, St. Andrew's could not accommodate a resident pastor. From 1819 to 1859, the Catholics of Oakville were served by mission priests who visited about once every 5 weeks. These clerics were a hardy breed of men. Through all seasons, they rode their horses along forest trails, carrying with them an altar stone, linens, vessels, books, and vestments. Parishioners who wanted to attend Mass more frequently were also a sturdy lot as they made the 2-day trek back and forth to Dundas, the nearest church. The earliest priests include Father McDonough, who established the Oakville Mission in 1836, and went on to build churches in Thorold and St. Catherine's. He was followed by the remarkable Father O'Reilly, who served Oakville from his parish in Toronto Gore between 1837 and 1847. At the same time as Father O'Reilly was ministering to Oakvillians, he was guiding his own flock away from involvement in the 1837 rebellion, and during the 1840s saving many of the newly arrived immigrants from Toronto's fever sheds. He sent lumber wagons to gather the victims of typhus, which they had contracted escaping Ireland's famine, on what were known as coffin ships, and brought them to his rural parish. Following Father Eugene O'Reilly, his nephew, Father John O'Reilly, who was pastor in Dundas, served Oakville from 1847 until 1858. Like his uncle Eugene, Father John was among the dedicated men and women who risked their lives in the fever sheds. Desperate for help, Bishop Michael Power, who himself died of typhus in 1847, asked priests from outside Toronto to assist. Father John ministered to some 45 people a day for 14 straight weeks until he succumbed to typhus, which, thanks to his youth, he recovered from. The first Oakville entries into St. Augustine's records begin in 1847, just before Father O'Reilly went into the fever sheds. These entries mark the March 1847 baptism of the 2-year-old twin daughters of James and Joanna Fitzgerald, and the April 1847 marriage of widower Michael Butler to Anna O'Loughlin, all 4 of whom were buried in St. Mary's Cemetery on Lyons Lane. A young Father McDonald was another priest who helped out in the early 1840s and was associated with another symbol of ecumenism. He boarded at 148 William Street, the house that later served St. Jude's as the Rectory and then Sexton's house. But to prepare for their first permanent resident pastor, St. Andrew's needed a rectory. The original structure would have looked like its 2 contemporaries directly east of it, the Rose Cottage at 308 William Street and the Galley Cottage at 307. Both built about 1856. Its construction overseen by Father O'Reilly, the home was built as a 1-story Regency cottage with a full basement, a rare feature in Oakville's early homes. That sturdy foundation showed foresight, as it facilitated the construction of the much more substantial 2-story building that stands today. According to the Albion Fire Insurance description in 1893, A second story had been added complete with wraparound verandas on both the first and second floors. One humorous story involving the peril of extensions and renovations was uncovered when the convent addition of the early 1960s was taken apart in the 1990s to create a large meeting hall for the building's new function. Apparently, when the sisters' bathroom was installed, the workers had to cut through the beams so they could make this bathtub sit closer to the floor. Little did the sisters know that each time they took a bath, they were in danger of crashing to the floor below. Balusters from the original staircase, which was removed in the 1990s, were saved and now decorate a minstrel's gallery. Architect Gren Weiss incorporated what was left of the Victorian wraparound veranda into a winterized sunroom. Located behind the rectory, where there are now gardens, stood the stable. When Father Jeremiah Ryan moved in as the first resident priest in 1859, St. Andrew's became the mother church responsible for ministering to several communities, including Trafalgar Township, Milton, Burlington, and Hamilton Beach. Therefore, he needed a horse and buggy, and these were sheltered in a frame barn. Between the home on Lot A and the church on Lot D stands the new rectory, which was built in the 1950s, but from 1840 to 1858, this was a cemetery. When the Newtown Cemetery was created in 1858, graves were exhumed, such as these two. All further burials took place at St. Mary's Cemetery. Father Terence O'Reilly, who would serve St. Andrews as a newly ordained priest from his arrival in 1876 to his death at age 39 from typhoid pneumonitis in 1884, was buried under the church. His tombstone engraved to read, "Erected by the Catholics of Oakville." The cemetery was then turned into a beautiful garden, its design and maintenance overseen by artistic pastors. Young Father Terence had been an active organizer of concerts, but another musical pastor was Father Arthur Savage, whose name did not well suit him. This gentle and talented pastor was president of the town's music and horticultural societies. Between 1909 and 1933, he cultivated the famed Rose Gardens, which were the location for the equally famed garden parties, held annually for 7 decades beginning in 1895. This popular event welcomed everyone in Oakville and the surrounding area. The presbytery grounds, with their brilliantly illuminated lawns and twinkling lights, took on the appearance of a fairyland. The ladies managed food booths offering everything from ice cream to more substantial fare, and the gentlemen operated the games booths, which provided diversions from darts and a fish pond to housey, a form of bingo. Professional singers, radio personalities, jugglers, and comedians were hired from faraway places like the Chicago Opera Company and the New York World's Fair to perform at the festival. The artistry that went into these booths can be seen in this windmill built by Dutch Catholics who immigrated after the Second War. The eastern half of the block, parts of lots B and E, and all of lots C and F, is now a parking lot surrounded by green space, but it has a rich history. As soon as Father Ryan arrived, he set about building a 2-story clapboard-clad frame school, measuring 24 by 36 feet, that faced onto King Street. When St. Mary's School opened in 1860, it boasted an enrollment of 107, a substantial number given that the 1861 census said Oakville was home to just over 1,400 people, only 356 of whom were Catholic. St. Mary's was historic first, the earliest Catholic school to be built in all of Halton, Peel, and Dufferin counties. Father Ryan served the parish well, not only as a spiritual leader, but also as an educational one. With his business acumen, he purchased several properties in Brantford and Oakville, which benefited education in Ontario at the elementary, secondary, and post-secondary levels. After building St. Mary's, Father Ryan purchased property for a convent in October of 1874, apparently out of his own pocket, so that the teachers would have a place to live. The convent, which later served as another school, was located diagonally across from the church in a home that still stands at the southwest corner of King and Reynolds. During the mid-19th century, it was popular for the middle class to send their daughters to cheap convent schools, to be taught lessons deemed appropriate for ladies to study. From some time in the 1860s or early 70s until about 1890, the nuns gave lessons in music, art, needlework, and other areas of education. It was an ecumenical school. The sisters welcomed girls from diverse backgrounds. Ryan's investments meant that upon his death he was able to leave money for bursaries for the needy, as well as a substantial legacy to his two nephews who came out from Ireland to become priests. The property left in the Diocese of Hamilton through his nephew Father Patrick Ryan funded the building of the brick-clad St. Mary's in 1930. His nephew Father Brennan used the money to purchase for his order 50 acres of Toronto farmland at Bathurst and St. Clair, where a century later St. Michael's College School relocated from downtown. Part of the land was sold later to fund the library at St. Michael's College at the U of T. Today, only a historical sign marks the historic St. Mary's, demolished in 1986. The property around the school provided ample space for recreation. In the 1890s, two Canadian college baseball stars came from the corner of Allen and Lakeshore, James Fitzgerald and Jack Cote. Perhaps James's father, the renowned captain, helped develop his young son's muscles by introducing him to a sailor's life. And one wonders if the Cote boys' success was nourished by carriage maker Louis Cote making time to throw balls to his four sons on the school field that backed onto their yard. Imagining aside, the two earned fame in the baseball world. Cote is one of the greatest pitchers Canada ever saw, and Fitzgerald is sports editor for the Toronto Telegram and first president of the Canadian Baseball League. While the 19th century saw some regrettable disagreements between Protestants and Catholics, St. Andrews always enjoyed a good relationship with other Oakville denominations. Sports were another opportunity for healthy cooperation. Between the school and the church was the parish ice rink, flooded by Anglican neighbor and businessman W.S. Davis, open to neighborhood skating and the venue for events like a masquerade ice follies. It was around the same time that Mr. Davis installed indoor plumbing in the old clapboard school. St. Andrews also had softball and carpet bowling teams, which enjoyed competing against the town's other church communities, and businesses like the Basket Factory. And now to the heart of the block, the church itself. St. Andrews is the only original pre-Confederation church still standing in Oakville. Inside this old but well-maintained building is a bright interior. The windows, which were atypically large for a pioneer church and would have made heating the church more costly, were designed not only for beauty, but for the abundance of fresh air that they could afford. Having built their church shortly after the 1830s cholera epidemic, the community would have sympathized with our pandemic interest in ventilation. Like any other home that is 181 years young, St. Andrews has seen several renovations. It was built in 1840 to accommodate 200 parishioners. The sanctuary wall of the original church was immediately east of the third set of large windows. In 1870, St. Andrews was enlarged to the east to accommodate 100 more parishioners, and this is when the last two large windows were added, the back wall located where the alcoves begin. Father Ryan also oversaw other improvements to the church. Parishioner James O'Connor crafted 3 elaborate altars, each a triptych decorated with spires, arches, and Gothic niches for statues. In the 1890s, statues of adoring angels were added. It is also likely that it was around 1870 that the 150-foot steeple was built. Parishioner John Cavan was working high up on the steeple when the rope that went through his pulley was let loose by a workman below, leaving him stranded above. He took off his stocking, unraveled it, let it down, and the ground men tied the rope to it. John was soon down for dinner. In 1910, the diocese advocated for a new brick church, but the parish had neither the funds nor the desire to demolish their beloved church. Instead, they made improvements. In 1916, a chandelier donated by W.S. Davis was installed, and the first 2 picture windows were commissioned from the Napoleon Theodore Lyon Company. Lyon had worked at McCausland's as early as 1868, but set up his own studio in the 1880s. His canopy design in Gothic style, which included fleshy leaves of a type not seen in McCausland work, became an N.T. Lyon trademark. The Gothic semblance of a heavenly firmament and the presence of angels well suited the Gothic altars and communion rails designed by James O'Connor. In 1918, Father Savage commissioned an organ from Cassavant Frères of St. Hyacinthe, Quebec. About the same time, they installed the largest church organ in America to the specifications of Canadian organist Linwood Farnham. The organ accompanied both the children's and adult choirs, whose members included recent immigrants like Bill Grammel and Fred Collier, decades-long manager of Frederick Harris Music, whose world headquarters were in Oakville. Oakville's population greatly increased after the Second War and the opening of the Ford assembly plant. To accommodate the newcomers, both St. Andrews and St. Mary's were enlarged between 1950 and 1953, and central heating was installed in the church. The current sanctuary dates from this time. It is also between 1950 and 1953 that the other 4-picture stained glass windows were installed by the Michael Studio of Toronto. William Michael was a Zoomer. He had spent most of his life working for other firms, including McCausland's, where he had been the art director for over 20 years. But in 1945, at the age of 75, he and his son founded Michael Studios. In the 1980s, church specialist Murray McCants oversaw a historically informed redecoration that brought with it such features as the current color palette, added detailing on the Stations of the Cross, as well as new altars, carpet, and a sanctuary lamp. Between 2009 and 2011, the narthex and new sacristy were added. Despite the many changes and the different people involved, there is an artistic unity that connects today's parishioners with the pioneer builders. A look at the sanctuary serves to introduce 4 unifying motifs. Throughout the church, crosses symbolizing the Trinity predominate. The sanctuary carpet has a repeating pattern of 1 large cross surrounded by 8 small ones. Since ancient times, church designers have used 9, the Trinity of Trinities, to represent perfection. Each arm of the large cross ends with 3 steps or crossbars, symbolic of the Trinity. In this way, it resembles an apostles' cross with 1 bar for each of the 12 apostles and 4 arms for the 4 evangelists. The processional cross connects this evangelist motif with the evangelist windows. Each arm of the processional cross is decorated with the symbols of the evangelists, as anticipated by the prophet Ezekiel in his vision of 4 creatures with the faces of a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle. Trefoil or budded crosses, with 3 leaf-shaped protrusions budding from each arm, are found at the top of each of the 14 stations. They can also be seen in the 4 large 1950s windows. Trefoil crosses decorate the hanging banners behind the saints and the bottom memorial section of each window, where the 5 trefoil crosses are interspersed among 4 straight-armed Greek crosses, again making a perfect 9. The sanctuary furnishings introduce another uniting motif, the beauty of creation. The upholstery features deer, swans, and a lion. Deer are symbolic of piety and religious hope. Swans are associated with loyalty and strength, and lions are emblematic of majesty and courage. Because it was once believed that young lions are born dead, but come to life 3 days after birth when breathed upon by their sire, the lion has become a symbol of the resurrection of Christ. The upholstery features exotic flowers as well. Throughout the church, lilies, roses, shamrocks, palms, poppies, and even oak and maple leaves are used to tell stories about Christ, his church, the people of the parish, and the beauty of nature. For example, in all 4 of the Michael windows, shamrocks predominate, a symbol of the Trinity and a reminder of the founding Irish parishioners. It is the only plant common to all 4 windows, and it is present in the ornamental ceiling medallions. Other flowers resemble the 5-petaled hawthorn, a symbol of hope that blooms in spring, and the green plants myrtle, a symbol of love, and ivy, a symbol of eternal life and fidelity. A third uniting motif are references to the parish's history. Oakville's first main industry is capitalized on the area's beautiful forests. Many early parishioners were carpenters, cabinet makers, and coopers. Their skills would have been highly valued in the town's shipbuilding industry, and so the marine imagery in the 2 back windows on the south is fitting. The finely crafted wooden altars and communion rails were sadly replaced in the 1950s with modern ones, and then replaced again in the 80s. Even though the current altars are comparatively new, they connect to the church's history. They feature 5 carvings of the life of Christ, crafted in oak by the Globe Furniture Company of Waterloo. The square altar features the Nativity, the finding of Jesus in the temple, Jesus with the little children, and the agony in the garden. The tabernacle altar depicts the crucifixion. To mark the 175th anniversary, a credence table and ambo were also commissioned. The sanctuary paintings introduce a 4th detail that is key to appreciating the aesthetic unity. According to traditional orientation symbolism, the south side of a church is the more heavenly side because sunshine is more predominant, especially in the morning. By contrast, the north can be seen as the more human side. Thus, Murillo's painting of the Assumption of Our Lady into heaven hangs on the south, and Murillo's depiction of the Holy Family on the north. Orientation influenced placement of the windows. Those on the north depict events and people related to Christ's life. The first depicting the announcement of his birth. The middle window, his family life with his mother, grandmother, and cousins. And the most westerly window, his ministry through St. Paul and St. James, patrons of teaching and the spiritual journey. Those on the south emphasize the life of Christ through his church, beginning with his Passion on Holy Thursday, the middle window commemorating St. Michael and St. Joseph, patron of Canada, and the most westerly window portraying the first pope, St. Peter and St. Andrew, patron of the parish. The north-south distinction is emphasized by the banners framing the portraits, the northern ones decorated with repeating squares, the four sides connecting to life on earth, like the four seasons and the four elements, and the southern with repeating circles representing eternal life. Connections among the northern windows include a focus on Mary. Lilies, the symbol of humility, appear in all three. The lives of the poor pioneers who built St. Andrews certainly exemplified humility. Connections among the windows on the south work similarly. Both angels and the keys to the kingdom appear in multiple windows to focus the viewer's contemplation on heaven. Chalice images in the first and last windows are a central focus. In keeping with orientation symbolism, St. Andrews was built so that the sanctuary faces east, the side of the rising sun, God's side. The main entrance faces west, the side of the people. Just as all the northern windows and southern windows connect with each other, so too do the windows connect across the aisle. Three small windows at the front could be called the children's windows, reminiscent of Matthew's Gospel. Unless you become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. They also connect to the carving of Christ with the children on the altar. A striking feature in the north window is the warmth of the colors and the intimacy of the family scene. In the Lord's window, the artisan from the Dutch firm Studio Flos depicted the 1858 story by showing Mary's appearance to St. Bernadette above a rose bush in a grotto, where Mary told Bernadette to dig a hole from which a spring appeared and miracles began to happen. Portrayed with her husband and child, the St. Gianna window was commissioned from McCausland's during the COVID pandemic. In the next windows, the image of Mary in prayer at the Annunciation faces the window with Jesus in prayer at Gethsemane. An interesting feature is the tapestry design behind Mary, pineapples being a symbol of eternal life and fertility. This pineapple motif repeats in the chandeliers. In the Gethsemane window, the artisans drew inspiration from the Gospel of Luke, a doctor, who emphasized the physical suffering of the disciples by saying they fell asleep from grief. His place of crucifixion, Jerusalem, can be seen in the background across the Kidron Valley, and the olive trees anticipate the wood of the cross. The windows next to the street entrance appropriately emphasize the parish as community. The St. Peter and Andrew window, filled with poppies, commemorates those who served in the Second World War. It contains the crests of the Canadian Navy, Army, and Air Force, and the coat of arms of Canada. Central Command of the Canadian Army, formerly on Bond Street, furnished a guard of honor when the church extension was dedicated in 1953. Opposite this is the memorial to the Catholic Women's League. A 1953 newspaper clipping shows League members at the annual parish garden party and records that it poured rain, but not before the CWL raised enough money for the window. A former mission itself, St. Andrews has always helped other missions. Besides being the mother church for the Oakville parishes, St. Andrews supported churches in Burlington and Milton until 1925. In 1976, Cardinal Karol Wojtyla, later Pope John Paul II, celebrated Mass for the Polish mission housed in St. Andrews, followed by a reception with the bishop in Hamilton, where unfortunately the cardinal's glass of sherry got knocked over, staining the carpet. After a later bishop replaced that carpet, one St. Andrews pastor humorously pointed out that by doing so he had destroyed a second-class relic of the new saint. Situated on the waterfront trail in view of the lake, St. Andrews is open every day to all those who wish to make a visit.